I'm David Garner. I'm a composer. I've taught here at the conservatory since 1979. I'm an autodidact composer. That is, I've never had a composition lesson, which may or may not be a good idea. We'll see what future generations think about that. My first quartet, which we're talking about today, was written in 2007. There was a lot of upheaval. There always is, but there was a particular amount of upheaval in my own life in 2007, which I believe shows in the quartet. But, it's funny. In retrospect and looking back on the decades of music that I've already written, it's very hard to tell whether or not my life is going sideways. And that led me to believe that it was really pretty irrelevant what sort of drama was going on behind the scenes in my life. It didn't seem to affect my music. There was a formal aspect, I think, to the quartet that was affected by my life at the time. But it didn't make it a bad quartet. And it kind of flies in the face of what you think about artists and art. If the artist is a mess, then the art is a mess. And I don't think that was the case with this quartet. I'm proud of it. I don't write like this anymore, so it is a period piece in the sense that I will not go back and revise it, even though I don't agree with some of the things I wrote in 2007. And the Del Sol did a hell of a job with it. It's not often that I think the piece is better when I hear it performed. I usually think that there's a platonic form in my head about how the piece ought to go, and then the mere mortals that play it come as close as they can. But in this particular instance, there were things that these guys brought out in the quartet I didn't know were there.
That's great. So Charlton, maybe you can also just introduce yourself and sort of what your relationship with the piece is.
Of course. I'm Charlton Lee. I am the founding member of the Del Sol Quartet, and we are now 30 years old, which is kind of insane.
That is insane, yeah.
Yeah, and I have a connection as well to the school because I'm an alum as well. So it was
Three alum, yeah.
Exactly. Really fun to work with David for actually the first time, even though we've known each other for a long time. And this piece was a real blast.
Yeah. So, Del Sol, like you said, has been around for 30 years, which is such a feat of, to have any kind of group be around for that long. But also one that really primarily focuses on contemporary music. Just so that we can sort of put the whole project in context, can you talk a little bit about sort of why that's the focus for Del Sol and how that manifests for you all?
Yeah, I think we started around 2000. There was always a lot of passion for playing contemporary music, but we reached a point where we felt like we could do much more to contribute to our community by focusing on contemporary music, because at that time there weren't that many groups,
right.
And yet there was still so many composers writing a lot of great stuff, and we thought, wow, if we just if we focused here, then we feel like we could give something, share something with our community, as opposed to yet another interpretation of Beethoven,
right.
However good that might be.
Sure, yeah. Right. Yeah, sort of a practical and philosophical decision, it seems like, yeah. So I'm also curious, what is the process for both of you? Performing a new piece is such a collaborative venture, and I'm curious from both of you, like, what are the things that you start with when Del Sol is going to start working with a composer, when you have a brand new piece and you want to sort of explain it to a string quartet, sort of what are those first steps? Maybe David, you can start when you talked a little bit, so you have this ideal of how the piece wants to sound. How much of that do you bring to like the pre-rehearsal or the first rehearsal, or do you like to sort of be hands-off and let them...
I don't say a word. Being a trained pianist and cellist myself, I have infinite respect for the amount of effort it takes to interpret a piece written by somebody else. I also know that composers, being a composer, take infinite pains to try to write down every last thing that we think the performers are going to need. Absent all of that, there's still the humanity involved in the ensemble itself and what it brings to it. And that's the thing that is most exciting to me, is I know what the piece is supposed to sound like.
Right.
I know what I think about it, but I'm not at all interested in telling them anything about it because they're going to find things, as I said before, they're going to find things in it that I didn't know existed.
Right.
And they may not do that if I say, oh, you need to look for this now.
Sure,
This interrelationship is super important. Well, maybe it's not. You
Yeah.
know, maybe there's this other thing that's
Right.
even cooler.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that's great. And Charlton, what about you? What's your sort of first, when you get a new piece like this and you're sort of cracking open the score and looking at the parts, how do you approach that as a group, and how do you approach the fact that, well, if there's a question, you can just call the composer, right? You can't call Beethoven anymore, but he's right there, so you
Can't even email him.
Right, yeah. But you have him as this resource, but how much are you sort of seeking that out, or do you also like to sort of come to your own decisions before involving the composer in the process?
I think the process is complicated. Like
Yeah.
we look at it in both directions. One, in terms of just like how our experience of absorbing the piece as we play through and things pop out and we notice certain types of structures or patterns or particular interesting musical ideas that are coming through to us. At the same time, we pay a tremendous amount of attention to those little details that David was talking about earlier,
Right.
Because they, basically bothered to write them down. It's like,
Yeah.
if they didn't mean something, they wouldn't
put it in
written
there.
it.
Yeah,
Sometimes composers write things and they mean something and they don't quite say what they mean, but they've written something, so there's something there. So we're trying to, play with that. And of course, ultimately, playing it for David, having that opportunity to
Right.
work with a living composer is, I think, part of the joy
Yeah.
of working, with a contemporary piece is that you can actually interact and, in a sense, collaborate with the living composer to come up with something that is magical
Yeah.
and new.
Yeah. I mean, that's something I like about contemporary music too. It's it's
Exactly.
really fun to have a back and forth with the creator of the work before the audience even hears it. Because if it's standard repertoire, you'll have sort of a back and forth with the audience as you perform it more and more. But this way, there's sort of like a deeper level that can emerge before the audience even hears it. So, David, you mentioned that this was a tumultuous time in your life when you were writing the piece, but that sort of it ultimately is not a tumultuous piece. I'm wondering, is there any kind of a programmatic element to it, or are there themes around it? Is there a sort of meta sort of purpose to the piece, or is it just sort of like concert music that we should experience as concert music?
One of my students a long time ago accused me of being an arch formalist, which I took as a great compliment.
And what do you think he meant by that?
Well, this quartet's a perfect example of that. It's 4 movements in the usual centuries-old tradition.
Right.
A sonata, and then you have a scherzo, and then you have a slow movement, and then you have a finale. And sometimes the are switched depending on the affect that you want to create, or the emotional arc that you want the audience to go through for the whole piece. So that's what's going on in this piece. The language, as I said earlier, is not one that I use anymore, but it's very. Was it you? It was it was either you or Sam in the quartet that described it as crunchy. the harmonies were crunchy, and there's a lot of added note kinds of things to purposely blur some and control some of the resonance and blur some of the tonalities. The thing that I wanted to brag about is that the scherzo in this quartet is one of my favorite Baroque dances, which is a gavotte. And so I wrote a gavotte and trio for the scherzo, but it would be as if Edward Gorey wrote the gavotte. It's sardonic, it's dark, it's not at all what you would expect from a French suite or an English suite, and yet it still is really a gavotte. It has the form of and the rhythm of a gavotte. I've tortured students with writing gavottes for many years, and I've written several for different instruments. And then the other thing that makes this quartet particularly stick out is that the slow movement did not exist. As I think I told Del Sol early on, am allergic to slow movements. And this first started with my piano trio that I wrote for my good friends Alyssa Rose, Adaya McAdam Summer, and Kesuke Nagagoshi. And I wrote them a piano trio, and I left out, because I wasn't interested in it, a slow movement. And Kesuke said, I will not perform this trio unless you add a slow movement. And so
well, now who's the arch formalist, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yes, touche. Yes, exactly. And so this quartet, I think, the emotional arc originally was intended to bypass the darkness of the intimacy and the solitude of the slow movement, because the scherzo was already dark. So, but I don't remember if it was the same. Adaya and Alyssa premiered the quartet as well. With two other members. I don't think they were actually a quartet. Oh yeah, Picasso. They called themselves a Picasso quartet. I don't know if Adaya, who's a good friend of mine, may have brought up the fact that she wasn't going to perform unless there was a slow movement. I don't remember. But so there's a slow movement in it that one of my former students thinks is one of the most beautiful things he's ever heard. I don't know why it turned out that way, and I don't know, but the audience reactions to that slow movement are pretty the same.
Yeah, and so that's something you added.
I believe so.
Yeah. After.
And finally, the finale is a tarantella.
Okay.
It's a knuckle busting fast 6/8 canonic, right? And it flips over on its side. It does an impossible thing, and then it thinks, well, if it's a possible thing, I can do it upside down. So it does the impossible thing upside down. I have not been murdered by any string players yet for that. And the Del Sol, as you hear in the recording, pulled it off beautifully.
Yeah. Charlton, I'm wondering, from the experience of having played the piece, I think a lot of David's music is sort of playing with these dance forms, and there's a new bass clarinet sonata that I'm looking at right now that also has really interesting interactions and combinations of old dance forms with different contemporary styles. What's it like to play that? What's it like to sort of hey, wait a minute, right. This is a tarantella, but this isn't how tarantellas are supposed to go.
I think that's one aspect of David's music that is really fun, is that you have exactly that almost schizophrenic in a good way quality where you're jumping from traditional forms but with a modern twist on it, and trying to figure out how traditional do we want to play it,
Right.
or should we go with, just like throw everything out the window and approach it from a like almost
Pure,
deconstructionist
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
mentality. The tarantella also, David didn't mention, it's like later on starts warping into all kinds of, like there's a folk thing that comes in, and then at the end it's almost like a burlesque type of dance that comes in briefly before
Yeah.
the mad rush to the finish.
Right.
And so you have all these different qualities, and
Mhm.
and I think part of what's fun for us as interpreters is like weaving our way through
Right.
this, and then just like, okay, and now switch, and now we're into this, and then now we're into this, and,
Yeah.
so I think that aspect keeps it very lively, and I think if we pull it off correctly, then the audience also catches like, whoa, where'd they go? It's
Right.
like, what happened?
Yeah,
You know?
exactly. Yeah, that's wonderful.
I remember now that I forgot about the folk melody that comes out of nowhere in the last movement. That actually came to me in a dream, and it stuck in my head. It's a terrible earworm, as I'm sure you know, and it stuck in my head and stuck in my head and stuck in my head, and the tarantella, as I had intended it to do, was going sideways, and in fact the whole quartet ends unraveled. It just falls apart. Having introduced and explored and developed everything, it didn't really figure that it needed to end. So it just stopped. It didn't end, it stopped. But, the thing is that the premiere of that quartet, when it comes to a screeching halt and this beautiful, simple folk melody starts in F, the audience laughed. And I thought, how rude. And then I thought to myself, wait a minute, that's relief.
Yeah.
It's time to stop this schizophrenic and maybe just have a moment. And so I think that worked beautifully. It's very unexpected, and it's very simple, and exactly what the ear needs. It's a amuse-bouche,
Yeah.
palate cleanser.
Yeah. Reminds me of like the end of the Berg violin concerto, when suddenly, it's crazy, 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 and then just this weird chorale in the distance that sort of like contextualizes everything a little bit, like to have like some simplicity and just like very straightforward beauty, kind of is like, oh, I needed that because it's been so frenetic until that point.
There's one thing that I rely on heavily in one of my greatest influences, which is Bartók, is that he challenged composers. He said that the hardest thing that he thought the composer could do was to compose a folk melody that sounded like it was indigenous, that you could not tell that it wasn't a folk melody.
Right.
He had that much respect for indigenous and folk melody. So I've tried that in numerous pieces. The next collaboration that the Del Sol and I are embarking on is they will be performing my second quartet in March of 2023. And that quartet is about as different as it can possibly be from the first one.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today, and it's really been interesting to learn about this process and hear about the piece in so much detail. And thanks, and I hope you all enjoy the video.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Jeff.
Yes.